Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this special edition of Guyana's Oil and You. I am your hostess this evening, senior journalist of Kaieteur News, Kiana Wilburg, and tonight we have with us a very distinguished guest. He is Mr. Christopher Ram, a chartered accountant and attorney at law who has also been a staunch advocate for transparency and accountability in Guyana's oil sector. Mr. Ram, welcome to tonight's program and thank you for being part of the discussion.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Mr. Ram, I can hear you quite clearly.
Here we are.
Thank you very much. We can now see that your camera is on. All right. So, Mr. Ram,
Kiana, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you quite clearly, Mr.
But I
Ram.
can't hear you.
Okay, it's 1 minute. It seems as though we've been experiencing. Hi, Mr. Ram, can you hear me now?
I hear you now. Are you
Perfect.
hearing me?
Yes, I'm also hearing you as well, so we can get straight into our program tonight. Mr. Ram, the government has been in office well over 100 days. How would you grade its initial handling of the oil sector? And do you think the pandemic can be used as some sort of excuse, per se, for some of the things it's not been able to accomplish?
Well, I think the most significant development, and I use the word development rather than achievement, is the granting of the license for Payara.
Okay.
And I'm not sure, I was not impressed with the manner in which that was done. I think the government allowed itself to be rushed into granting the license, despite the fact that there was very little consultation input. We know that they had retained a Canadian group, but other than that, we don't know very much, and that's very disappointing. I thought, given all the problems with the parent agreement, that's the agreement that then Minister of Natural Resources, Raphael Strotman, signed, and I think it was June 2016. I would have thought that the government would have been far more cautious in approaching any further development, having got itself locked in to the arrangement with the license, and apparently the timeline, the deadline of September 30th was driven entirely by ExxonMobil. And it was the government of Guyana appeared to have just played along and having made noises about what it's going to do and how it's got to look at it carefully. It just on the stroke of midnight, practically, it gave in, and that was disappointing. I can't say I've seen anything else. We haven't had a single piece of legislation. There is no indication of legislation. We know that, but maybe I should stop there and let you ask your follow-up question, Kiana.
Yes, thank you. Surprisingly, the next question was going to be about the legislative agenda of the government with regard to the oil sector. But before I get to that, we had the release of the petroleum license, the production license for the Payara project. And we also had the release of the environmental license, the permit. Have you been able to review these two documents, and do you think that they're strong enough?
I am an accountant, an attorney at law. I cannot claim any sufficient knowledge, let alone expertise, on the question of the environment.
Okay.
I can tell you those with knowledge in that particular segment of the sector, and I think of Attorney at Law Melinda Janke. She clearly was not impressed. We have got no legislation, none, dealing with environment and the petroleum sector. And I think it's a grave omission by the new administration that it has not addressed this problem. We are back to 1986. Either the agreement, the Petroleum Exploration and Production Act, and the Petroleum Exploration and Production Regulations. 1986. That is what allowed the 1999 giveaway. That is what allowed the 2016 giveaway. And what do? Nothing. So I'm not impressed.
Okay.
I know there's talk about local content. The committee was established.
Yes.
We wait to see what will happen.
Okay, since you've mentioned that issue of local content, I know that you would have raised concerns when the license was first published that there's a provision which allows for the local content requirements or commitments of the contractor to be published after, when the law requires it to be done before this license is given. So in other words, the government is supposed to see a plan by ExxonMobil about how it will go about increasing local content. What are its local content plans, the plans for hiring locals and using local businesses as part of the operations or development of the PIR deal. But we saw that happening until after, the government giving ExxonMobil to do this after. What is your take on the flouting or the breach of the law in this regard?
Well, it is a breach of the law. And what is even more striking, Kiana, is that people who ought to know what the law is clearly did not. And that is shocking. It is damaging. It is dangerous. Even the 1986 Act and regulations were very clear that the applicant for either an exploration agreement or a production agreement must have satisfactory plans, and they must be satisfactory to the minister regarding local content. And Kiana, I keep saying the same thing. I don't think the government listens. Apparently governments have a tendency not to hear. They speak, but they don't hear, and when they hear, they don't listen. I've said this so very often. And if the government heard, didn't know, well, that's a serious indictment. If it knew and it acted in defiance of the law, that is dangerous. So take your pick.
Okay, thank you for that comment, Mr. Ram. I'm going to move on to the legislative agenda of the government for the oil and gas sector. We're close to 1 year of being an oil-producing state, sir. In spite of all of the advice that we would have received locally, regionally, internationally on the importance of having a solid legislative agenda to ensure good governance cloaks this sector, we've still not seen concrete efforts to get this done. How do you view this about Guyana's future and the government's seriousness about really protecting this sector from the ills that we have seen taking place across the world?
You know, Kiana, I don't easily subscribe to conspiracy theories.
Okay.
But I wonder to what extent the 5 months hiatus and the shenanigans by the APNO coalition and the PPP's embrace of and the mutual embrace of the Western countries and the PPP, whether we may be dancing with the devil, whether we are truly serious. And again, I've said this before, we don't have resources, locals, to carry out maybe one or two licenses. If we're going to allow Exxon, and we have, let's not quibble about this. APNO, OFC, and the PPP have both allowed Exxon to call the shots. We do not have a depletion policy. We're not even sure how we combine our embrace and whether the two things are in fact compatible of environment and fossil fuel development. If we are going to have this mad rush because Exxon wants to strengthen its balance sheet, it has performed so badly over the past 10 years. Guyana is in fact almost a lifeline for Exxon. The share, just look at the stock market and Exxon shares. So we are dancing. We are dancing to Exxon's tune. And so we'll have all of these developments. We don't have a population policy. We don't know what we have. And, you know, that can be very disappointing at a critical stage like this. We're not in a normal situation where you can say, okay, let's take our usual time, the Guyanese style. We'll do this in due course. We don't have time. We have our country as far as petroleum is concerned, as far as our economy is concerned. Because if you recall, when the Minister Bishop Ejel read his budget, it was oil 54% growth, something in that region, non-oil something about 4%. So if we are not in control of the major sector of our economy, then we're really not in control of the economy. We don't have the Petroleum Commission. Surely we could have had some movement on that. We should have had environmental guidelines, strict environmental guidelines in relation and legislative in relation to the petroleum sector. We haven't had those things. So I know your newspaper, its proprietor and publisher, Mr. Glenn Lal, has been championing a cause, and I know he's particularly the Kanji and the Kaieteur block,
Yes.
which were given away in the most striking and suspicious of circumstances. Yet, as you said, we don't have politicians who seem to listen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so all Guyanese have to do, look, wait, watch, wait to see when the benefits of oil and the benefits of this big economy will trickle down to the average Guyanese. We still have a minimum wage in the private sector. And this is an indictment of this entire society. The private sector commission should hold its head in shame that it's comfortable living in an economy where you have $200 a month as the minimum wage in the private sector, where the private sector minimum wage is so much lower than the public sector minimum wage. Where is the Minister of Labor? The coalition had no Minister of Labor. This current administration has one. What is it doing? So if we look at the international media, whether it's Bloomberg or any one of those things, or you think Guyana is this fantastic beacon, this shining star on the hill. But what does it mean and how does it translate to the average Guyanese? Yes, we were early days in terms of oil. We were not in early days in terms of city government. The PPP was in power from 1992 to 2015, 23 years. They're not novices. They haven't just come in. They should have come in with a clear policy. And they used to say, we're going to hit the ground running.
Yes, that has been said a lot during the campaign trail. So on that note, Mr. Ram, speaking to the legislative agenda and all of the issues that you have pointed out, would you say it's safe for one to conclude that the new administration, which you've said is not a novice to this, that it's sleeping at the wheel?
I know this from personal experience. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of activity. We're all busy, 7 days a week. We're almost on a permanent campaign mode. So maybe not sleeping at the wheel, but it's a question of priorities. It's a question of whether we give and we boast in our state media. And, I've always advocated Chronicle should be privatized. It is doing the same work for the present administration as it did. Well, it was more egregious under the coalition, but we didn't need that. We boast, for example, I saw a headline in the press, we give $51 million to small businesses. Well, you know how many more small businesses than we have in large businesses. And look, one large business would come and get, instead of 51 million, vastly different higher number by factors of 10 in concessions. What are we boasting about? So, sleeping at the wheel, I can't say that.
Okay.
But priorities, absolutely. We have forgotten. Now, don't tell me you're helping this sector. I draw a distinction between working class and supporters. We have got to address the poverty in this country, because by the time we get around to dealing with sharing the wealth, and I don't necessarily mean it in a Clive Thomas sense, that every household must get 5,000 US, which I thought was ridiculous to start with. Guyanese continue to migrate, despite the fact that the US is becoming what Trump described our country as. So it's a little bit, it's more than disappointing. It's not good to say as early as this that we are disappointed, because we great at photographs and getting on in the newspapers. What are you doing for the poor people of this country? Don't tell me you give small businesses $51 million, because that is not even chicken feed. It's an insult.
Mr. Ram, I'd like to take your attention to the depletion of our oil and gas resources. It's well known that ExxonMobil is on an aggressive exploration and development campaign offshore Guyana, and it hopes to bring about 5 oil vessels on board by 2026. At the slow rate we're preparing for the oil and gas sector to govern it, to manage it in an effective manner. Does this leave you worried that we might be incapable of catching up?
Well, if you're running so slowly, when the pace is pedestrian, pardon the pun, what will happen when Exxon accelerates? And, it might be more than Exxon. What is going to happen? We will never be ready. We will always going to be behind the curve. So legislatively, we are not. Local content policy, we're not. The environmentally, we are not. We can't even do the audit for the 2015 figures yet. We're in 2020, we're moving to 2021. And, you have, according to the agreement, you have 2 years. So by the time that's gone, so maybe I'm coming back to, in some respects, we might be asleep. We just don't care. And it's sad when politicians neglect some of their most important obligations in favor of lesser but more romantic notions of what being a politician is all about.
On that note, Mr. Ram, I'd like to turn your attention as well to another important policy, apart from the local content policy, that is the depletion policy. We would have heard from the Vice President, Dr. Jagdeo, who has responsibility for oil and gas, as opposed to the Natural Resources Minister, to the effect that where a depletion policy is concerned, it has the potential to put a pause on the development of the resources. And in his view, the resources should be developed as quickly as possible, given this whole talk about the transition to energy and where that might leave Guyana, whether it's with stranded assets or not. What are your thoughts on this particular matter?
Every economy, every country, every sector, there is something called absorptive capacity. We can't. As I said, we cannot cope with the one well story, the Starbuck block. We can't cope with that. Now, and as more licenses are issued, because we've hit the sweet spot as far as oil discoveries are concerned. So it's, I am hearing more right-wing economics from what is supposed to be a working class government than I've heard for a long, long time. So it's almost as though we're honoring, yes, we are. We're honoring unrestrained capitalism, unrestrained exploitation. And to say that, we're going to miss the boat. No, that's what management is all about. Management is sometimes saying, we're going too fast, or we're going too slow, or we're going in the wrong direction, or we need to shift course for a while. That's what management is about. But Kiana, is because we've screwed this thing up. And that was from 1999, the Janet-Jagan Agreement. We have in our legislation the right to get equity in these entities. We ignored that right. Trotman, who never seemed to have known anything. Trotman was an absolute disaster. But instead of the current administration say, look, we're going to clean up some of this mess. We have got this Clyde and Company report. You know, the government is correctly going after wrongdoings by individuals. They have access to the cabinet papers. Let's see what actually transpired. As Clyde and Company in this report said, we need to know, the Guyanese people need to know. This is not the private property of any government. The coalition did the same thing. It would give nothing. Granger could be, he could be the most tight-lipped person. I think he probably has the record for the least number of press conferences for any president of this country, and maybe most countries. But it's the same. We need to have, and you journalists need to start asking some serious questions. Don't ask me the hard questions. Ask them. If you at least have a badge, you have a right to ask questions. We have an access to information legislation that we don't have. We have a commissioner, but he doesn't have a budget. He doesn't have an office. It's not functioning. It's not only oil, which is why I wonder the slothfulness, whether it's a general problem,
Okay.
or a specific problem. But the fact is, we are not moving.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Mr. Ram. I want to go to the conversation on gas to shore, bringing gas to shore. That's been another big issue for the PPPC administration, which is looking to ensure that this project is realized within 3 to 4 years. There's a lot of concern where this project is concerned as to whether Guyana is doing everything that is necessary to ensure it doesn't make the same mistakes of other countries where these matters are concerned. Do you believe that the government, do you get the impression that the government is doing everything in its power to ensure it's going about this project in the right way, that it's learning from those who've walked this path? And what is your take as well that the team for the Gas to Shore project is being led by a controversial individual, that is Mr. Winston Brasington?
Here again, I was saying that's a question you should put to Mr. Winston Brassington, the gentleman who was leading us to Amila Falls. You remember that one?
Yes, absolutely.
Not quite sure what is decided now about this gas to shore. The agreement has specific provisions in relation to the discovery and the use and the rights and all of that. Have we thought of all of these things? I am not convinced, Kiana, that people who ought to know have even bothered to read the petroleum legislation. And I say that because I've had discussions with persons, local content, petroleum, various areas. Nobody seems to know. And because we have an opposition that destroyed itself in trying to rig the March the 2nd elections, it has no credibility. A lot of the persons are busy trying to keep themselves out of trouble with the police. They're not serving the interests of the electors who voted for them. And there were many, many, many. So I would say that the press should be asking Mr. Brassington, asking the Vice President, what is it that we are seeking to achieve, and how do we coordinate it? Okay, is this for our generation? Is it GPL? How is GPL being readied for this dramatic change from the fuel to gas? We don't know. How much is it going to cost? What is it going to do? How do we finance it? Who will construct it? There are so many questions that I think we are ignoring, all in the name to say we've got this big project. We've got hotels in almost every village in the country soon. And the people in the villages the village economy has been destroyed. It was destroyed a long time ago. This is, in my view, if we want to rebuild our country, then we have got to start from the bottom up. Not top down, not a Hilton to the village, but the village to a Hilton. And we do that. You've heard me say that Raman McCrane's budget focus for 2020 said it could not believe that we haven't touched on the national insurance scheme. That's a serious issue. That's a worker issue. What have we done with it? Absolute silence. Minimum wage, absolute silence. Protection of workers, cleaning up in the, I think it was 1997, the Termination of Employment Act. Henry Jeffrey, senior minister, then said that was the beginning. It was to build. It was to, and all you have to do is go to Hansard. That was the start. Corbyn, Rupnarayan, all of them spoke extensively during Parliament. And what did we do? We've actually reduced rights on the Termination of Employment and Severance Pay Act. We've reduced rights under pressure from the private sector. I've heard nonsense about, if we have minimum wage, you're going to destroy employment, you're going to destroy the economy. Well, if this economy has to prosper on a $200 a month minimum wage, then it's no economy to talk about. It's an economy for the few, whilst the masses get nothing.
Thank you very much for that comment, Mr. Ram. We're going to take a very short commercial break, and when we return, we'll continue our insightful discussion with Mr. Christopher Ram. Good evening and welcome back to Guyana's Oil and You, where we're having a very insightful discussion with Chartered Accountant and Attorney at Law, Mr. Christopher Ram. Sir, I want to just talk a little bit about auditing, where the ExxonMobil contract is concerned for the Stabroek Block. Can you explain for our listeners what the provisions in the Stabroek Block production sharing agreement say, what it says about the rights of Guyana when it comes to auditing? And when you're finished explaining that, can you say whether or not you're disappointed that we're taking so long in terms of the auditing of the pre-contract costs?
The ESSO Exploration and Production Guyana Limited, as well as its partners, HES and CNOC Nexion, are all branches of companies that are incorporated in low tax or no tax jurisdictions. That's a start. Notwithstanding that, as branches, these companies are subject to statutory audits under the Companies Act. There is some ambiguity whether the auditors need to be local auditors or whether they can be foreign auditors. The truth is, and the fact is, that the auditors of all three companies are locals. In fact, I think it is a single audit firm. So that's the statutory audit. The Guyana Revenue Authority, which does play a part in the petroleum agreement, because you recall, the agreement says the company prepares its tax returns and gives it to the minister to run the errand, to take it to the GRA, and the GRA then issues a certificate that all companies have paid taxes, which of course they have not paid. It's really it's a dupe. So the GRA itself can do an audit. The fact that it really gets all companies pay no taxes, because all that happens, this so-called payment of taxes, is an allocation of the government share under the production sharing agreement. It comes out of the government 50%. So it's all companies pay nothing. But the agreement also provides for the minister to cause for an audit to be carried out. So there are three levels. Now, as an auditor myself, I can tell you that that could be a recipe for some confusion. Three persons, three of us doing the same audit. But surely, what I think ought to have been happening, and I like the idea of the Petroleum Commission, which the APNU had actually tabled or put out a bill. The government, this current administration, has not, I don't believe it has said whether or not it's in favor of a Petroleum Commission or what is in its place. I believe the Petroleum Commission should have had a special audit unit, a really serious special audit unit, and you've got experts here, you've got experts out there. We mustn't feel it's some big mystery. There are all kinds of suspicions that Exxon or whoever has some pipe leading from here to God knows where and siphoning off. Some of those things are nonsense. The fact is, the oil comes up, it goes into tankers. Tankers have a certain capacity. It's easy to measure. It's not like if you go in Main Street and you buy a meter, but it's not that different either. So we mustn't make it sound like if this is a physical commodity. It's not the type of things that bitcoins and futures and so on that really put auditors in a spot. This is straightforward physical commodity. It's internationally priced. You have all the costs laid out before you. It cannot be an overwhelming responsibility to carry out an audit. The fact is, somebody has got, as I said, there are 3 levels. The GRA has more than enough work. It's not easy. GRA sometimes plays police and thief with taxpayers. So that they have their own share of problems. We saw the other day the kind of problems that the administration of the GRA has to contend with.
Mr. Ram, if I can interject just very quickly. You said that there are 3 levels of the audit. The minister can do an audit, GRA can do an audit, and then there's a statutory audit that has to be done of the companies. Now, could you provide a timeline for these? Is there a timeline for each of these audits to be completed?
As far as the statutory audit is concerned, they have to be completed in time for tax returns to be prepared and filed. Everybody puts the kind of timeline. For if you have a calendar year, then by April 30th, you should have finished.
Okay.
If you've got as I said, the Petroleum Commission, and you had this unit, maybe the Department of Energy. I don't know what Dr. Baino did. I don't know where he is. But they could have said, look, we want to do this work, and we do it in real time. So you get, we're in December now. You get maybe October or November report, and you go right away and do it. So there's no fixed time. There's no limitation on which you should be doing this work. You do it as quickly as the report comes in. You carry out your audit.
So there's no deadline.
Sorry?
There is no deadline within which you have for the auditing of these costs?
The minister's audit has a 2 years deadline.
Okay. And when that 2 year is up for auditing the cost, development, production costs, there's no way that it can be able to go back to those costs. If that time has elapsed for the auditing of costs, let's say the cost that incurred in 2015, then that time period is up.
Quite frankly, it's not that bad. All he's got to do, whisper it to make it public that the GRA should be looking at these things. They don't have it, they have as much as 7 years. So there's no, and as it's often said, if fraud is involved, there's no time bar. So it can be done, Kiana, but again, we've been talking since the 2016 agreement came out. We said, do something about it. Trotman did nothing. And now we have this new administration appears to have done nothing about the auditing of costs and auditing of these statements that are being prepared.
Okay. Let's move on to another topic.
Something's wrong. I can't hear you.
Okay. One minute, please. Can you hear us now? Okay. Just give us a minute here, please. We seem to be experiencing some technical difficulties.
I'm not hearing you at all, Kiana. Can you hear me?
What about now? Can you hear us now, Mr. Ram? All right, we seem to still be experiencing some technical difficulties. We'll go to a short commercial break, and hopefully, when we return, we can continue our discussion with Mr. Ram. Mr. Ram, you can hear us now?
I can hear you now, yes.
Okay, well, it seems as though we don't have to go for that commercial break after all. Yes, Mr. Ram. So before we had that sort of technical disruption there, I was asking you about the behavior of the government or the approach of the government where the auditing of the costs are concerned. And I was interested in finding out from you if you believe that all the reports in relation to the audit of these costs should be made public for the citizens to be able to scrutinize.
Well, the answer is an emphatic yes. I don't think there's any proprietary or confidential information. And obviously, some of those things can be protected, but I really can't see the circumstances that would justify the type of financial information that would normally come out as a result of an audit. So yes, it should be made public. Everything about the oil sector should be made public.
Okay. Now, there are two other issues that I'd like to speak on. I would love for us to discuss before wrapping up tonight's program. And the first has to do with the calls for a national oil company, whether Guyana should get involved in this type of business. Given your financial background, sir, what is your take on this? Is this a route that we should go down?
Well, it depends. What is this national oil company going to do? We are not in any way managing the sector. We should be regulating the sector. My own view is a petroleum commission could equally do the type of work. I have some reservation about creating all these entities, and you pay big salaries for all kind of high-sounding, flashy titles, and then what do you get out of it? So I don't see any immediate need for a national oil company. If we did take up our equity stake in petroleum operations, then there might have been a case. But I don't see what the oil company can do now that than say the Petroleum Commission cannot do.
Understood. Sir, oil is known for creating its own tempting opportunities for corruption, and tackling this has been one of Guyana's biggest issues, the issue of grand corruption. Given all that you have observed and witnessed where accountability and transparency is concerned in Guyana, do you get the impression that there is a genuine appetite for arresting grand corruption and putting the systems in place that will prevent it from overtaking oil and gas?
First of all, Guyana did not need oil to become corrupt. Guyana is a seriously corrupt place. Obviously, oil with its vast number of digits, it has corruption on a considerably different scale. I don't think there's been a sufficient effort to tackle the question of corruption But I want to tell you, and I'm going off because this is my hobby horse. Uh, you want to see corruption? Look at campaign financing in this country. And I don't know if you know this, but GCOM has decided that it's not going to enforce the laws relating to elections expenses. Incredibly, the chairman of GCOM, chairperson of GCOM, a retired justice of the Court of Appeal, would state that in writing. That is mind-boggling. What it does mean, the political parties that control GCOM have decided, you know what, we don't want any kind of controls when it comes to campaign financing. So we have anti-money laundering legislation. We have an Integrity Commission Act, which requires statutory declarations. The Integrity Commission certainly doesn't have the type of resources and the scale of resources it requires in order to do its work. The Commissioner of Information doesn't function. We don't have a register of interests. You've got people moving in and out. Robert Prasad is a classic example. He moved in and out from politics to politics. Now, that is so fishy. That's not the kind of thing we want to tolerate. We've had licenses being given, petroleum agreements being given to people without any resources whatsoever. Now, all of that breeds different forms of corruption. And as you know, it's not just the public servant taking a bribe, but we always bear in mind that it's the private sector that offers that bribe. So if we do not take our time, develop each element of the oil and gas sector, including disclosure of information. We had heard, I recall being at the launch of the transparency issue with the from the government, the ITI. We're not hearing anything about them. So we can have all types of and mechanisms for addressing corruption if there is not the serious will, and if the leadership of the country, whether it's the leadership in terms of politics, in terms of opposition, in terms of government, in terms of churches, in terms of businesses, if we don't get serious about corruption and stemming the tide of corruption, if we don't pay people proper wages, as I come back to the minimum wage in the private sector, then there will always be a strong inducement to engage in corruption. And if we are going to have the big ones protected, whilst it's the small persons who get face the courts, who face all the tribunals for their own minor forms of misconduct, but the bigger ones get away with all forms of illegality, then we wouldn't have any place to go. And I don't think for one moment that Guyana will ever get as bad as some of those serious countries that have got oil. At the same time, I think if we are serious about developing our country, then and developing the sector, It cannot be to line the pockets of a few persons, privileged persons, whilst the person at the bottom just get crumbs. So corruption, legislation, and all of those things go into the mix. And I think we're well behind the line to deal with those problems, whilst there is an acceleration of the exploitation of petroleum resources in the country.
Mr. Ram, I just want to follow up on one of your statements. You spoke about the former Minister of Natural Resources who was out of politics, took a sabbatical, and then he returned. There's been a lot of concern and controversy regarding his role in the award of the Kaieteur and Kanji oil blocks in suspicious circumstances. Are you surprised that he was retained to be part of the governance structure of the PPP in light of the concerns that are well known to most Guyanese?
Well, this was a man who, after the 2015 elections, said he was taking a sabbatical. He was hobnobbing, of course, with Trotman and the then government, and government changes. One of the senior members, I would suggest, in the machinery, having witnessed politics for a number of decades, Kiana, nothing surprises me about Guyanese politicians anymore. Whether the politicians themselves or those who appoint them. After all, Mr. Robert Boussard did not appoint himself as Foreign Secretary, a post that was alien to Guyana, but yet there he is. And no doubt he may still have his petroleum consultancy. We don't know. And that's the kind of declaration of interest, and to understand, well, what is happening with this whilst you're now a leading light in the government.
Okay.
So, all of those things, in my view, Kiana, they help they foster a culture of, if not corruption, a culture of suspicion. And it makes the average person wonder, well, what am I doing this for? What am I standing up for? Because you change governments and then nothing changes.
Understood. Mr. Ram, we've come to the final few minutes of our program, and I'd like to wrap up with your final thoughts on the state of Guyana, which is just mere days away from its 1-year anniversary as an oil-producing state.
Well, I think you should bear in mind, Kiana, that Guyana is still, and the world is still faced with pandemic that is on a scale that we probably have not seen for 100 years. So that's a major challenge. We've got some areas that have really been badly affected. I think it would be the government probably deserves an assessment of failure in its handling of the pandemic. We're not quite sure how it has affected the economy, but I know your interest is on oil. 1 year on, the government has done nothing about legislation. It has given no indication of what its legislative agenda is in relation to oil and gas. It has not, as you said, we have no depletion policy. We have no environmental regulations dealing specifically with the petroleum, though we do have water quality type. So we have a very long way to go. We've had 5 months when the government was, or what is now the government, was consumed in a battle for democracy. The battle, at least for the time being, has now been won. Democracy can never be taken for granted. Look at, they boast about being the most democratic country in the world. Look at what's happening with that leading dictator and autocrat, Donald Trump, who you might notice the Americans, the Canadians, the British, and the EU are not criticizing him, but they were criticizing Guyana, and you wonder why. So 2020 is a year we probably would all like to forget, though it will be the most memorable year for most of us. Let's hope that as 2021 approaches, not only the government, but you in the media, those in civil society will decide, you know what, we have to protect democracy, we have to hold government responsible and accountable, and we ourselves, those who are leaders, must lead by example and must show that they are committed to a Guyana of equity, a Guyana of justice, a Guyana where the rule of law prevails, and where from the president to the lowest person at the lowest level of the economic and social ladder stand in the same light as far as laws are concerned. It's a tall order. I still hope next year time like this we can be more optimistic and enthusiastic about where we are.
Okay. Thank you very much for your closing remarks, Mr. Ram, and for being part of tonight's program. And I do hope that you continue to be a staunch advocate in the fight for transparency and accountability, not just in the oil sector, but throughout this great nation. To our listeners, wherever you are, thank you for participating in tonight's discussion as well. We hope that it has been of a use to you, that you can walk away learning something tonight, and we do hope you can join us next week, same time, same place, for more insightful insights into what our oil industry is all about and what some of our local, regional, and international minds have to say about it. Once again, thank you, and Mr. Ram, I do hope you have a good evening.
You too, Kiana. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.